Good morning, welcome. My name's Marie Wilson. I'm the Chief of Place and Communities Division here at Geoscience Australia. Geoscience Australia values the lands, water and sky as we work to deepen a shared understanding of country and earth. We respect First Nations peoples and their enduring connection, contribution and obligations to country. Reflecting on our shared history, we are committed to listen and learn. Today, I'm on the country of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people and acknowledge their elders, past and present. So welcome to the Distinguished Geoscience Australia Lecture Series, which is a series of presentations in recognition of Geoscience Australia's staff members' major contributions and achievements in the field of earth science. So today, I'm delighted to introduce three senior members of the Maritime Jurisdiction Advice Section. They will be sharing the benefits and progress associated with the digital transformation of maritime boundaries within Australia under Australian-led international programs and our global influence. Speaking first today will be Mark Alcock, who is the Principal Advisor of Maritime. Throughout his 32-year career at Geoscience Australia, Mark has provided outstanding service to the Australian Government, neighbouring countries and the international maritime community through his leadership and cooperation in maritime affairs. In 2017, Mark was elected to the International Seabed Authority's Legal and Technical Commission, where he plays a leadership role in establishing regulations and environmental protections for deep sea mining. Mark was awarded a Public Service Medal earlier this year for his international leadership in maritime affairs. Our second speaker will be Duncan Moore, who's a Senior Geospatial Advisor. Duncan has 20 years' experience at Geoscience Australia, applying geospatial data skills across natural hazards, geology, critical infrastructure, groundwater and maritime projects. And he has a Masters of Applied Data Analytics from the Australian National University. And our final speaker this morning is Natalie Tafts, who is a Senior Advisor of Maritime Jurisdiction Advice. Natalie has over 15 years' experience contributing to scientific, technical and legal initiatives to establish and secure Australia's maritime jurisdiction. Natalie holds a Bachelor of Arts in Geography, a graduate certificate in Spatial Science from the University of Adelaide and a Master of Laws from the Australian National University. So please join me in welcoming them to the stage. Thanks, Mark.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for all of those that have come in person and also those that are online. Today, we're going to be talking about the Maritime Boundaries program at Geoscience Australia, which is a program that has a long life in the marine sense, but is a direct successor for the work of Charles Scrivener establishing the borders of the Australian Capital Territory. And the Australian government officials have been responsible for establishing the borders and the administration of Australia's territories and the areas that fall within Commonwealth land administration responsibilities, which are still, although not on land, are still significant. And so really I thought I will follow this brief introduction by the evolution of the Commonwealth responsibilities in this federation. But I thought it would also be worthwhile to acknowledge that this is a program that is done under close collaboration with colleagues from the Australian Attorney General's Department, who unfortunately could not come here this morning. They had to brief their secretary because they have a new minister. And our colleagues at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And the screen has gone because I've knocked it. Okay, excellent. I haven't lost it. So this next part is just really explaining the development of the Commonwealth's responsibilities. In 1901, really, the Commonwealth, in the newly formed Commonwealth, there was no need for this function because everything was administered by the states that had joined the Federation. But Charles Scrivener had to undertake the first roles as Surveyor General or Director of Surveying at the time, when it was decided that the Australian government be formed in a separate territory and the Australian Capital Territory was established and the associated Jervis Bay Territory. Actually a separate territory, although often mistaken as being separate. At the same time, the state of South Australia relinquished its northern part to the Commonwealth to form a territory, and the Commonwealth became responsible not just for the territory, but for the administration of lands within that territory. In 1933, the Australian Antarctic Territory was added. And Ashmore and Cartier Islands in the north. In 1947, Heard and McDonald Islands. And in 1954, the first major extension of the marine jurisdiction, the establishment of the continental shelf, legal continental shelf, to the 200-metre isobath. In 1955, Cocos Keeling. 1958, Christmas Island. 1979, Norfolk Island. And then the next major expansion of Australia's jurisdiction and the responsibility of the Commonwealth was when the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea came into the force. And the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea has been called a Constitution of the Seas. It sets out the responsibilities and the rights of states, and it establishes the possibility of states establishing marine jurisdiction. So that's to a 12-mile territorial sea, a 200-mile exclusive economic zone, and an extended continental shelf. And each of these have their own rules for establishment, and Geoscience Australia has been a party to the negotiation of the convention with other officials in the Australian government, and the implementation and establishment of our rights under that convention, which we received a significant increase in 2008 by the recognition of our extended continental shelf submission. And although I should know the figure, I think that brings us to a maritime jurisdiction of about 11 million square kilometres, which is, of course, significantly larger than the entire land jurisdiction of continental Australia and Tasmania. But I think the point that's really important is that so often we think of Australia as a landmass of Australia and Tasmania, and sometimes we think of the territories as an afterthought. But this is, in fact, the map of Australia as a country, not just as a landmass. So the point that I'd like to make here before proceeding is that there has been a continuity of activity for the Commonwealth since 1910 in the establishment and management of space. Scrivener had the role of establishing the Australian Capital Territory and the land administration system within it. But continuously throughout that time, there have been people who've been responsible for delivering this function to the Commonwealth, which means that this program has a history that extends over 115 years. But for us, the challenges were very different to our predecessors. In 2000, the Commonwealth Surveyor General role, which was a statutory function, was repealed because the Commonwealth relinquished all of its land administration functions, and it was thought that there was no longer a need for that function. I'm not sure if that was the best idea. Which left the Commonwealth responsible for all the offshore jurisdiction, residual responsibilities in the territories and the external territories, and of course there are times when the state and the Commonwealth have to interact and establish the boundaries between administration. At the same time, there was a merger of the geoscience capability and the geospatial capabilities of government, and unprecedented technological change. So in 2000, it was not only completely acceptable, but the only mechanism of making declarations and administering space was by written descriptions and paper maps. But by 2000, GIS delivery was starting to replace the use of analogue products and paper. We had precision navigation was coming into existence, so the early delivery of GPS, or the complete implementation of GPS. And most disruptively for us, the democratised access of geospatial information through platforms like Google Earth. So all of the previous information that we had used to develop our maritime boundaries had been cartographic, secondary sources. Some of those very old sources and at a very coarse scale. Google Earth allowed the physical geography to be visible for the first time to the public in a way that previously had been the monopoly of government agencies. And since our baselines are determined by the coastline, that meant that it became much harder to defend the determinations of the baselines and limits that we had used. At the same time, the Commonwealth's focus had shifted from a land responsibility to an offshore responsibility. And when we got these new rights, there has been an explosion of regulation within that space that we now control. And unfortunately, although there is a convention, the Convention on the Law of the Sea, which can be called a constitution of the seas, the fact that it exists does not mean that there is agreement on what it means. And you would see, I think most people would be aware that there are disputes, particularly in the South China Sea, but in many other areas in the Mediterranean between Turkey and Greece and others, on what that convention actually means. And so one of the things that we need to do to defend the legitimacy of our boundaries is be influential in the development of the law that supports their establishment and the international system that we rely on. And lastly, an unexpected issue developed really in our understanding of this issue developed post-2000 and really, past 2010. Climate change has a significant impact on maritime boundaries, which are established by the physical features. And so the world is having to develop a response to this to preserve maritime boundaries for states that are affected. So quickly moving through, this is things that people in Geoscience Australia will be more familiar, but this program is part of Geoscience Australia's function as a national public sector geoscience agency. And our main role, which is in the title, is to deliver certainty, stability, predictability and visibility from Australian maritime boundaries. So those are mostly administrative functions in government. We have to deliver support systems that support planning the marine jurisdiction, and as part of our mechanism of supporting the convention, support to our neighbours in establishing their jurisdiction. And so quickly, the hierarchy of boundaries is something that is critical for understanding our role, because for each time you undertake a regulated activity, this pyramid of priorities has to be observed. So before we can establish offshore petroleum titles, first of all, we need to know where the national boundaries are, the boundaries between state and Commonwealth responsibilities, the limit of the coastal waters, and then we need to be able to harmonise boundaries between each sector and ensure that there are no conflicting regulations. For instance, a marine protected area over petroleum, a production title in petroleum. This just quickly shows, again, the breadth of issues that we are involved in regulating. Our role is very different to a state land management agency, which has at its focus land title. The marine jurisdiction is a multi-use system that has many separately administered legal frameworks to allocate rights and responsibilities. So given that we have this increase in responsibilities and the need for being and the need to respond to this changing world, there are four main ways that we are dealing with this problem. So the first, because we needed to be able to significantly improve the Commonwealth's understanding of the geography of Australia, is to establish what we would call an authority of geography. That's used a little bit differently to the way that a lawyer would use it or in the spatial community. This is, as best as we can, an objectively correct and legally defensible realisation of the understanding of the coastline and the associated topography of Australia, because they are the foundation of how we establish our rights. And so a large part of our program for the last 15 years has been to realise those data sets so that if we wanted in the future to move towards a fixed declaration of maritime limits, we can go to the government and say we have a no regrets understanding of the jurisdiction. Another challenge is that we have to be able to develop new systems for the digital management and declaration of maritime boundaries if we want to be able to proceed to a digital future. This is something that has been done nowhere else in the world and needs the development of new ideas that are complementary to similar initiatives being undertaken onshore for land administration, in which I understand our CEO has past experience. We have to engage internationally to protect the principles of the law of the sea in which our jurisdiction is established, and regional security on which the peace of the region depends. And then, as mentioned in the last, an issue that is an existential issue for the Pacific, but also an issue for Australia. We are now having to work with partners in government and the region and globally to develop a legal response to the impacts of climate change on maritime boundaries. And so this is the general form of our arrangements to deliver this, and the main pillars of our program. At the centre is the framework, the intellectual framework for managing offshore jurisdiction. Rules for maintaining consistency, rules for, first of all, moving from a coastline to a baseline, creating maritime limits, rules for how declarations of maritime boundaries are made, and ensuring compatibility between different sectors, and spatial consistency between different legal objects, the development of international standards and the international initiatives. On the right is, in fact, I suppose, the core of the program, that is realising and managing Australia's maritime boundaries, the surveying of the coastlines, the determination of baselines and limits, and the technical systems in which we manage our data and maintain its integrity. And of course, one of the things that's important in law is the law has to be accessible. So that means that the complex geospatial products that we produce inside GIA, that we are able to use, that for us are simple tools to use and provide a great deal of utility, are of no value to the general public, to the person in the street, to a non-specialist. And so one of the things that we have to do is make these complex products available with the same utility that you had with a paper product, and that means we have to have technical systems for the simple delivery of that. So we produce electronic data, we deliver that through through AMSIS. We also produce official maps, which are the standard depiction of Australia's jurisdiction that is presented to other states. We include our data in hydrographic charts to ensure that it is accessible to the mariner. And one of the other important functions that we have to undertake is a deposit of maritime boundaries to the Secretary-General of the United Nations for due publicity to the international community. So with that, I'll pass to Duncan.
Okay, thanks very much, Mark, for that introduction. So now we'll talk through establishing the authoritative geography. The fact is, I think we all recognise now that we live in a data-rich world where access to information is widely available and easy to access. Mark mentioned the democratisation of imagery through Google Earth when that was made available, and this is in the order of 20 years ago when it became an option for just about anyone to have a look at imagery and also to interrogate other information quite easily, such as the coastline data. So for us, what we're looking at doing is improving the accuracy of our coastline and also to capture missing features. This is the component of the program that we're talking about within this section. It can be quite technical, so I'll keep it reasonably high level. So Mark mentioned the objectively correct geography. Now that's the geography of Australia as best we can identify. If we're looking at a short answer, then this, in terms of a low water coastline, is the authoritative geography. It's the first of its kind in one single data set. It includes Australian mainland and Tasmania and the external territories, and it's been captured at a very high resolution. We've done this through collaboration with the states and Northern Territory and also with academia. We've used archival data. We've accessed spatial professionals from different fields, certainly through engagement with the state governments. We've used new acquisitions and emerging technology to build this coastline data set. And now the long answer, of course, is the rest of this presentation. So in terms of developing an authoritative geography, we also have topography to keep in mind. This is the AusBathy Topo 250 metre digital elevation model. So it's a 3D elevation model of Earth's surface. We commissioned Dr. Robin Beeman at James Cook University to go and access the Australian Hydrographic Office Laser Airborne Depth Sound Archive, the LADS archive, and to go through and reprocess that to extract out more information pertinent to this product. So that covers information in the Great Barrier Reef, Torres Strait, and other areas. And Rob also went through and looked at improving existing survey data offshore, new acquisitions as well from Multibeam, and the inclusion of Digital Earth Australia's intertidal extent model. And I'll go into some of that in the coming slides. But this topography here covers both offshore and onshore. The colour ramp used here shows the definition in the offshore, but you can trust me that it also covers information onshore and a seamless transition between offshore and onshore as well. So these are the partners that we've collaborated with. There's no need really to go into those. In terms of the work that we've done here, we've led this program from our section, and we have drawn a lot upon the Digital Earth Australia coastlines products as well, which have been actually fundamental in completing this product to this date. And here's an example where, working with the Tasmanian government, we went through and captured further aerial photography for Tasmania for the coastline. This is just the slice in time between 2010 and 2021, so you can see the coastline extent that's been captured. They then went through, having the photogrammetry or grammetric skills and professionals, they went through and extracted the low water coastline for us. But the intention is to release products as we go through this program, and so the imagery that was used here is already available on their website. In terms of the Digital Earth Australia products, we've used several of them. It's continental scale, which is really useful for us. It's already standardised, it's analysis ready, so it makes it simple for us to go through and do coastline extraction. We can also use it to compare coastline data we can extract from here to the aerial photography derived coastline as well, to get a comparison as to how accurate that is. So on the left, we're looking at an example of the low tide composite, and on the right, we're looking at the high tide. So in some cases, we have extracted a coastline vector from the left-hand image and all the way around Australia where it's available, and then used that for that comparison, and also used it to directly insert into the coastline product. This is the intertidal elevation model item. This has been very useful in terms of that seamless transition in the AusBathy 250 DEM product, the elevation model. It's very difficult to survey in this space in the near shore. It tends to be fairly turbid, so there's sediment in suspension, and it's hard for the sensors to get an indication of depth in that zone. This process, using the Landsat archive in Digital Earth Australia, has looked at how often those cells are dry, and then gives an indication as to the elevation of those features. So when Dr. Beeman went through and generated the AusBathy 250 product, you would have multi-beam surveys that are offshore. When you come closer to nearshore, you might have some LADS data, some laser airborne depth sounder data, and then you would transition through this item product, use of our coastline data in the middle, and then transition to land-based elevation capture to form that composite. This is a very difficult area to transition in elevation models. And lastly, this is the DEA coastlines product, and this produces an indicative coastline for each year that's available. And this gives us continental scale understanding of coastline variability. And as coastline is important in determining and generating maritime jurisdiction, it's important for us to be able to understand the stability of Australia's coastline. And it's unlikely that any country elsewhere in the world has this ability for a multi-decadal solution to understand stability. So it's really exceptionally useful. So if we have a quick look now at the coastline data in a little bit more detail, we'll do a comparison here against the Queensland state government's coastline that we're showing there in white. Initially at this stage we can see that there's further information that we've captured for our product. Some of those features there on the Great Barrier Reef won't be part of Queensland, so you can understand that they're not in there. And importantly, you can see that in our product we've included the river extents as well. So we've got a connection with the coastline to the surface hydrology, and this can then connect into GA's surface hydrology product further to give us catchment level understanding. Now, in doing that comparison with the state government coastline here, it might suggest that there wasn't value in this data, but in fact this data has been exceptionally useful. So it gives an understanding of what's already available. We can then use this information to compare against what we have. We want the information to be authoritative, so we want to know we've captured everything. So this is a cross-check that we can use to then go and make sure that we have everything within Australia's jurisdiction, and also to do some quality checks to ensure that the low water coastline extends further out than what Queensland have captured. So all this information we've pulled together to do those comparisons. We'll take a closer look at Gladstone. As we zoom in, you can see further detail. You can see some of the reef features offshore. These are low water features which aren't exposed at high water, so we're talking about reefs in this case. And to give you an indication, on our website we state that Australia's coastline is in the order of 30,000 kilometres long. That's for the continental mainland and main islands. Here we've captured a broader extent than what's in the 1 to 100k topographic coastline, so that's a part of the equation. But we've also captured low water features and included rivers, and we've captured in the order of 250,000 line kilometres, so almost an order of magnitude more than what's in the stated length for the 100k coastline. So it's a detailed product. This is a satellite imagery, so this is of course straightforward for anybody to turn on these days, but it's the ubiquity of this sort of information. And this is a digital elevation model that Dr. Beeman produced for Gladstone. There are in fact 4 of these through the Great Barrier Reef, which are 30-metre elevation models, so they're higher resolution than the national product. And here you can see the conformance of the coastline data with the elevation data. And you can pick out further information such as the dredge channel that runs into the Gladstone port there as well. So all these information products come together to form a common picture to give that authority. So as we move back to look at the Ausbathy Topo 250, we've described some of that in some detail as to how that was produced. So we have got the conformance of the coastline in here with the coastal edge on the elevation model. This now provides a connection to the landmass of Australia with the processes of the landmass with the oceans. So, and this information can be used certainly for other purposes as well. And one example here, looking at the Burdekin River, if we were to look at some sort of injection within the catchment of sediment, agricultural outputs, industrial runoff, so forth, then you could use the coastline that we've generated, GA's surface hydrology data, the elevation model, and hydrodynamic modelling to then look at the impact of that injection into the catchment and to see where that ends up. Equally, this product could also be used for modelling storm surge offshore and travelling in towards the coastline and making its way into the river, given that connection. And now I'll pass it back to Mark.
Thank you, Duncan, and I'm now going to talk about far more boring topics: standardisation, management and visibility. And I have to say, I have had to be a chair of a standardisation committee at the IHO for the last, 16 years. I have to say that it does not play to my strengths, but it is an essential element of our program. In managing jurisdiction, standardisation, regularisation is critical, but also the engagement in the international standardisation community has given us access to knowledge that otherwise we would never have conceived, and has been an enormous advantage for us in developing ideas in our program. So as Duncan started, this identifies the parts of our program that I will cover, but in hopefully relatively quick succession. So the core of our standardisation process, or of our standards, the standards that we are using, is the international standards, the ISO standard 19152, the Land Administration Domain Standard, which is conceived was originally conceived to cover both land and water. It's essentially a digital cadastral model that had been led by the Netherlands. I cannot say that the discovering its utility came from us. It was our colleagues in Canada that pointed out the merits of this standard, and working with our Canadian colleagues and other colleagues internationally has really allowed us to move forward our thinking on digital management of boundaries in a way, as I said, that we could never have conceived. But our entry point to that standard was not through the ISO, but it was through the IHO, when in 2004, following Australia's unsuccessful attempt to deposit our electronic maritime boundary data at the UN, a General Assembly part of the General Assembly resolution on oceans and law of the sea was paragraph 6 established a mandate for the UN to work with the International Hydrographic Organisation to develop standards for the collection, storage, dissemination and information for the deposit of maritime boundaries. So that gave an international mandate, which originally was being delivered by or chaired by the UN. Unfortunately, they received some pushback, which was technical but not in principle. And with the UN, any pushback means that they look for someone else to take responsibility. And since we wanted it, we took on the responsibility. And so since essentially 2009, we have been leading the development of IHO S121, which is the Maritime Limits and Boundaries Standard within the IHO S100 framework, which is a general framework for delivering marine information that is led by the IHO, working with other international organisations. And so with that process reached a major milestone in 2019 when we got version 1 of IHO S121. And since one standard is all that's, I think, in me, we managed to contract Chris Boddy and another person from Canada to lead the redevelopment of ISO 19152, to break it into a multi-part standard, and most importantly, to establish part 3, which is marine georegulation. So I was also quite happy that we standardised the term georegulation as an ISO term. But these are the foundations for the way that we manage our maritime boundary information in Australia, and has given us an intellectual framework that is much more rigorous than what was already a rigorous framework, and a path to international exchange of maritime boundary information, but also conceivably a way of improving the sharing of cadastral information and seamless administration in all states, including Australia. So that's the underpinning technology that we are using. And our goal in implementation is that for each piece of legislation, there is a matching data set that is managed, that is delivered by Geoscience Australia, that is spatially correct and exactly matches the legal definition, so that there becomes a one-to-one connection between the regulatory data sets and the law. And the way that we deliver that is through AMSIS, which is the primary portal for access to maritime boundary information in Australia. I can say that as this is an ongoing process, some of the boundaries are better than others. The cost of producing the boundaries is incredibly high to do them at high precision. And so things like the national boundaries are done to great precision. Petroleum is done to great precision. Environment to reasonable precision. And Others that I won't mention haven't been updated since 2006, but they're other portfolios' responsibilities. So I will now pass on to Natalie, who will deal with influencing international media.
Thanks, Mark. So a key component, I've hit that. A key component of our program is participating in international initiatives. And this includes working with partners to develop regional approaches on emerging issues, including the climate change impacts on maritime boundaries. So we implement two major DFAT funded initiatives, and one is focused in the Southwest Pacific and the other is focused in the Southeast Asia region. And the purpose of our involvement in these initiatives are to build relationships between officials in the regions to work together on maritime boundaries, and where this might be too sensitive, to build collaboration on sort of non-controversial matters. We're also involved so that we can positively shape the implementation of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and also so we can support regional security through stable maritime boundaries. So really underpinning this international work is the principle that good maritime boundaries are the foundations for the peaceful use of the oceans and contribute to maintaining peace between nations. And the program we implement in Southeast Asia is the Marine Resources Initiative, and this is run under the DFAT Southeast Asia Maritime Partnerships Program. And through this program, we support Southeast Asian countries to manage their marine resources by providing training in marine geology, hydrography and ecology, and by identifying areas where small investments by Australia can facilitate agencies in the partner countries to deliver on their mandates. The second program we're involved in is in the Southwest Pacific region, where we work in partnership with DFAT and the Attorney General departments, and a consortium of regional organisations on the long-running Pacific Maritime Boundaries program. This program first started back in 2006. And under this initiative, we support Pacific countries to secure and manage their maritime limits and boundaries, including treaty boundaries with neighbouring countries, and to deposit their boundary data sets with the UN in the S121 data standard. So the countries in the Pacific have finalised more than 70% of their maritime limits in the region. But one of the emerging challenges that has come out of our work with the Pacific is that climate change presents an existential threat to many Pacific Island countries, especially the low-lying atoll states, whose islands are predominantly composed of sand and coral material. So these islands are only a few metres above sea level, and being made of sand and coral, they are highly vulnerable to sea level rise, and also from storm surges overwhelming the islands, as well as the impacts of ocean acidification and bleaching of the corals on which the island formations depend. The most recent IPCC report shows that global mean sea levels are rising and accelerating at an unprecedented rate. So this means sea level rise is a real and fundamental threat to low-lying Pacific countries. In a maritime boundaries context, rising sea levels could impact the existence of the islands from which the maritime jurisdiction is generated, and more importantly, on which the citizens of these countries depend for their livelihoods. The impacts of sea level rise on maritime boundaries is a challenge that could not have been foreseen by the drafters of UNCLOS, and there are no provisions in the Convention on Climate Change. So as a result of this, a gap exists that needs to be resolved through either interpretation or progressive development of the law of the sea. In response to the threat posed by sea level rise on their maritime entitlements, Pacific Island countries have engaged in a collective effort to develop a regional practice and a global response to ensure that their maritime jurisdiction cannot be reduced by climate change-related sea level rise. And as part of this, in 2021, the leaders of the Pacific Islands Forum, which represents 18 countries and territories in the Pacific region and also includes Australia and New Zealand, issued the Declaration on Preserving Maritime Zones in the Face of Climate Change-Related Sea Level Rise. And this sets out the Pacific's position on how UNCLOS should be interpreted and applied in response to sea level rise. So as part of this declaration, it states, "We, the leaders of the Pacific Islands Forum, declare that once having in accordance with the Convention established and notified our maritime zones to the Secretary-General of the United Nations, we intend to maintain these zones without reduction, notwithstanding climate change-related sea level rise." So in order to operationalise this statement, it requires the explicit declaration of all the limits of their maritime zones by location using coordinates that would be compatible with GIS technology. So declaring the limits by location will provide certainty in the location of the maritime limits of these states, stability as these baselines without the effects of climate change would have otherwise been stable, and will provide visibility of their jurisdiction through that process of depositing the data at the UN and also the distribution of the digital data through the Pacific Forum. So all states whose maritime jurisdiction depends in whole or in part on the existence of healthy reef systems are potentially impacted by the effects of climate change on their jurisdiction, and that includes Australia. Although there may be an impact on the outermost limit of Australia's maritime jurisdiction, the greatest economic and administrative disruption could be at the boundary between the states and the Commonwealth jurisdiction in the coastal waters. So the coastal waters are a body of water that extends approximately 3 nautical miles from the coasts of the states and the Northern Territory, and which is particularly sensitive to any change due to its narrow width and the very large number of features on which it depends. So UNCLOS was really founded on the core principles of stability, certainty, equity and fairness, and it achieves this through the stable division of maritime space. However, climate change really presents an emerging challenge for the law of the sea, and states are demanding approaches to protect their maritime jurisdiction from any loss. In response, Geoscience Australia and the Attorney-General's Department and DFAT are working with the Pacific on a regional response to climate change. I'll hand back to Mark to wrap it up.
Okay. Thank you. So particularly since there's a couple of minutes, it's worth having a few final words. And look, I thought this is a very long-lasting program, and it's a complex program that is multi-generational. And so all the work that we have done is built on the work of our predecessors. And so I think it's worth recognising, I suppose, my immediate predecessor in the role, Bill Hurst, who had done an exceptional job of moving the thinking forward and establishing the first digital representations of maritime boundaries that were produced by Australia. And many of the ideas that we are using came from the work that he did in the early 2000s. I will say, or maybe a bit controversial, the surveyors may be sensitive, but I think that if the Surveyor General role had not been abolished, there would be a very high likelihood that he would have been the person that would have been the successor to the last Surveyor General. So I think it is worth recognising his contribution. But also, this is a program that has been done in collaboration with the states, and the states have shown enormous goodwill in delivering this program. Although we did fund some additional capture of imagery to fill in areas of gaps, much of the coastline capture has been undertaken by state officials. Our objective was that this was a collaborative program from its inception. If this work, as this work progresses to implementation, consensus between the states and the Commonwealth is essential, and having the states as party to this work smooths the transition to that implementation phase. And of course, to recognise all the people in Geoscience Australia, in the Maritime Boundaries team, but also more broadly, Earth observation, even the geodesists. This has been very much a team effort of hundreds of people. So with that, I'll pass to questions. Thank you.